Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
The year is 1347. The place is the port city of Kaffa in Crimea. The situation is that the city has been under protracted siege by a Mongol army. And that army that's gathered outside the gates is now suffering from a disease that they've brought with them from the steppes of Central Asia. As the siege goes on and on, the desperate Mongol army begins to actually fling the dead bodies of soldiers that have been infected with the plague or the certain sickness that they brought with them into the city. And as a result, the inhabitants of the city that's under siege, the inhabitants of the city of Kaffa, also begin to succumb to the horrors of this particular virus, this particular sickness that's been brought by the invaders. So much so that there are Genoese traders, there's Italian traders that are in the city. They flee from the city. And in the process, they take with them back to Genoa and ultimately to Sicily what will come to be known as the Black Death. My name is Don Shelley. Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Today on the podcast, we're going to explore one of probably the most powerful what-ifs of history for the last millennium. And that would be what would have happened, and we're going to focus specifically on Europe, but what would have happened if the Black Death, the plague, what is sometimes known as the Great Mortality, had not come to Europe in the early to middle parts of the 14th century. And we will discover that it's a very, very, very dramatic event in history, obviously, because of the death and because of the devastation of the plague, but also its impact on society, on politics, on government, on religion is quite profound. So looking at this particular what if today, this particular fork in time, we're going to do something new on the podcast, which is actually have a multi-part episode or a multi-episode exploration into a particular fork in time. So this is the first of the episodes that will focus on that as we consider the question of what would have happened if Europe had not suffered the Black Death. Before setting the stage, which is an important thing for us to do about exactly what the plague was and what actually happened in the real timeline of history, it's important to insert something of a disclaimer here. This was not the first and only pandemic, widespread disease, infection, plague scenario that's happened in history. It is probably and perhaps the largest that we're aware of, and it was also not limited to just Europe. The focus of the podcast and our historical what if will primarily focus on Europe, but that is not to say that there weren't impacts outside of Europe. In fact, what came to be the Black Death in Europe actually had its origins in Asia and was devastating there, and then also impacted other parts of the world, including the Middle East and the Islamic world. And so we don't want to say that it was limited to Europe, because it was not limited to Europe. We don't want to say that it only impacted Europe, because it did not only impact Europe. But to keep the alternative timeline and a focus on an alternative timeline in a little bit more focus, which is already going to be a challenge, as we will see as we go through this, given the upheavals in society that were caused by the Black Death, and then as a result looking at what would not have happened as a result of the event not happening. We're going to limit the focus to primarily Europe. And so I just wanted to say that up front. This is not ignoring the fact that there were impacts elsewhere in the world, severe, tremendous impacts elsewhere in the world. But it is to limit sort of the scope of the discussion here on the podcast and on the what if scenario that we'll be exploring. So perhaps the first question to answer is, what exactly was the Black Death? Well, of course, it's also referred to sometimes as the Black Plague. You'll hear the term bubonic plague associated with it as well. It was the result of a bacteria. That's the Yersinia pestis bacteria, which can actually create several different forms of plague. It's believed by most modern scientists and those who have studied to be the actual cause of the Black Death. And this was, again, the first major European outbreak of a plague. It was really the second large pandemic. Prior to that, there had been one in the 600s, known as the Justinian plague, which had devastated a good portion of Eastern Europe and sliding over into the Near and Middle East. But the Black Plague was the first plague or the first pandemic event, which was a major impact on the continent of Europe. And so, obviously, because of European history and the role of Europe in world history, it tends to be something that we look at and see in a major way. So the bacteria that was the cause probably actually came from Eurasia, and came as a result of the expansion that had happened in the centuries before by the Mongols and the opening up of trade along the so-called Silk Road between Europe and the East. So there were a number of different elements that were now in play that allowed the people to be moving back and forth between Eurasia, including China, the area of the Mongols, back over to primarily Eastern Europe, but also into the area of the Mediterranean where trade was going on. And so there were goods going back and forth, things of value, again, hence the name Silk Road. The reason that it was looked towards as being something that was valuable to merchants. And the plague appears to have originated there as a result of famine and some situations that occurred where there was an outgrowth of the rodent population coming out of a situation that was favorable for them into a situation where they expanded the territory that they came into because of a lack of water and lack of food. And so, however, it actually started over in Eurasia, probably sometime around the early to mid 1330s. It was carried by the Mongol army, as was referenced in the example that we used to open the podcast, the siege that was there at Kaffa. But also it came from other sources as well and worked its way into Europe. And once it came to Europe, where there appears to have been less of a natural resistance to the bacteria, less of an immunity to it in the European population, it didn't take long for it to spread rapidly, and spread in a devastating way. A consensus does not exist among historians as to terms of the actual number of people that died in Europe as a result of the Black Death. Regardless of whether you take the low numbers or the high numbers, the devastation it's just almost impossible to imagine something as devastating, but ranges in terms of the number of people from the period from 1347 roughly to around 1350 is that perhaps somewhere between 75 and 200 million Europeans died. As a percentage of the population of Europe at that time, it could be anywhere from 30 to 60%. And there certainly were instances, because it was not consistent throughout all of Europe, where there were areas in Europe that may have suffered mortality rates that were in the 70, 80, 85% range, while others on the low side, although it's hard to think of 30 or 35% mortality rates as being low, were present in other areas. Historians' best guess as to the world's population here in the mid-14th century, the time of the Black Death, is probably somewhere around 450 million. And as a result of the Black Death, so not only the impact in Europe, but also the impact in other parts of the world, Asia, parts of Africa, the Middle East, is that population level went from 450 million probably to somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 350 million, maybe 375 million. Again, the numbers are just staggering. They're hard to imagine, and it set back the population growth of the world probably by about 200 years. In other words, it took about 200 years for the world population to recover back to the level that it was in the middle of the 14th century after the plague. And it's important to note that the Black Death, while that being the primary event and being a period roughly of about 15 to 20 years when mortality was the most intense and when most of the deaths occur, there tend to be recurrences of the plague once about every 10 to 15 years thereafter, as late as the 19th century in some parts of Europe. And so from the initial event, which was the major event again, that potentially wiped out somewhere between 30 and let's say 60% of Europe's population. Even as the population was growing back and society was rebuilding after that event, there were these subsequent waves of the Black Death and other plague that would come along that would retard that growth back to a normal population growth pattern. And so, while we will think of this primarily because of the big event, because of the Black Death as being contained to that 15 to 20 year period, roughly from around 1347 to the mid 1350s, the impacts did carry on beyond the major disruptive event. Beyond that, because of these recurrences that were frequent and did happen on a recurring basis for several centuries after that. So the initial event is the main thing we're going to focus on in terms of the deviation in the course of time, but it's important to understand that that initial event was followed by the subsequent events, which continued to reinforce the impacts and reinforce the change that had been brought as a result of the devastation. Another important sort of a disclaimer to make at this point is it's going to appear, and actually I guess is to some degree, that many of the impacts on society and other things from the Black Death actually turn out or have some positive impacts. And in looking at those positive impacts, and particularly how a separate timeline or a fork in time would have produced something different, it's important to say up front that this is not saying that what happened, the actual Black Death itself, the suffering that were endured by those who contracted and were killed as a result of the plague, just the devastation. It's hard to imagine not just the physical changes, but the emotional devastation that went on as a result of the Black Death. It's not to lessen those things. In many cases, we will talk about, if you will, what we might think of from our perspective now, several hundred years removed, and not subject to the exposure and the risk of the Black Death. We will talk about some of the things that did happen or could have happened, potentially in a positive light. Just understand that when doing that, we're not making light of the fact that this was an incredible event in terms of human tragedy and human suffering, particularly for those who were directly impacted by the Black Death itself. So, as we set the stage moving forward, particularly in contrasting the real timeline with an alternative timeline, to the extent that the actual happening of the event, the real path in history, not the fork in time, did produce some things which, looking back, are often viewed and can be viewed as being positive. That does mean that we're putting a positive spin on the event itself. It was a horrific event and something that hopefully mankind will never have to suffer again. Another important thing that we need to do, sort of as a precursor before we can talk about alternative histories, is to really establish what is the situation in Europe at the time of the outbreak of the Black Death. We are firmly in medieval, feudal Europe. It is not yet the time of the Renaissance. Society is organized primarily around an agrarian culture, and so we have large swaths of land that are owned by the nobility and or the crown, depending upon where you are and the political structure that you're living under in what part of Europe. And society is pretty much divided into three sort of larger segments. The nobility and the lords are obviously sort of at the top of the heap. There is something of a merchant class slash religious class, but not really what we would think of today, anything approaching the middle class. And then there are the serfs. These are the actual folks who are the vassals to the lords, the feudal lords who own the land, and they are responsible for participating in the farming activities, the work of the field, producing the agricultural results, and they do this in exchange for military protection that is provided by the lord and other benefits that are provided by the feudal lord to which they are associated. Society, for the most part, is centered around these smaller feudal lord arrangements, so it's a small enough area that it can be controlled and be under the influence of a single lord. And the number of people that are living there are paying rents to, and they owe their livelihood to the lord. So the relationship economically, which leads to the relationship in a feudal sense, is very much at the highest levels of politics, central control around a king or a prince or whatever, depending on where you are in Europe, the central political authority is. Their authority is given out to the lords who own the land, who own the estates, and the rest of society is just part of the system that supports that. And so it's a very hierarchical system. It's a system that doesn't promote, doesn't cause there to be movement among the population for the most part. In fact, most people will be born, live, and die within probably not much more than a day or a couple of days' walk from where they are born, where they live, where they serve, where they work. The exception to that may be when they go off on military service, or the other exception to that may be if they go on some type of religious pilgrimage. And so the backdrop for Europe in the early to mid 14th century is that of feudalism. It's a medieval society, and it's a society that is ordered, a very ordered society in terms of how it functions. The other great institution besides that feudal political system is the church. And the church at this point means, in Europe, with rare exception, actually means the Catholic Church, a single unified church. There has not yet been the Reformation and the Counter Reformation. There has not yet been movements that will cause Christianity to break into various fragments, Catholic and Protestant fragments moving down the road. What you essentially have, for the most part, is one centralized authority in the church, owing its allegiance to a central authority in the Pope. While there may be schisms or divisions at time over who should be in the role of Pope, the church itself is a unified body, and is also one of the institutions that supports the feudal society. The right of the king to rule is a divine right rule, so that's derived from religious service, and the clergy, the ecclesiastical structure, primarily comes from, with rare exception, the younger sons of noble families who go in and are able to get education and thus become members of the clergy. So the backdrop for the Black Death is a society that is very well established in its structure and in its form, that sort of rests on two strong pillars, one of those being the feudalistic economic system that's been put in place, an agricultural society for the most part, that is backed by and interacts with a single, very powerful, monolithic institution represented by the church. Another interesting element to think about here that again sets the stage that we'll be talking about in terms of the actual history as well as the alternative history is that literacy rates are quite low in society. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. If you're a vassal or a serf that is on land that has been granted by your lord, you do not engage in commerce. The nature of the religious service is that it's delivered to you in Latin by a literate priest. You do not have the Bible in your native tongue because the Bible has been translated into Latin, but there have been no translations into languages other than Latin inside of Europe that have, at least that have achieved any great spreading or dissemination among the people there. Is that you have a class of folks who are working the land, providing physical service and or military service as part of the feudal system, without a desire or demand by the Lord that they be able to read and write, and with really without much need for that. Their needs beyond those of food are supposed to be taken care of by the Lord in exchange for their labor. And so you have a society that, to the extent there is education, education is something that is for the noble or the elite. Education is closely tied with the church, and education being required to move up into high positions of clergy, and the primary those who were educated, those being the ones that were in the clergy. And so you have a backdrop as we get to the time of the Black Death where there's, again, as we've mentioned before, there's a society that is very stable in the economic principle of feudalism and how that plays into the political spectrum, but there's also not a wide free exchange of ideas or publishing books, literacy in such a way that there's much of a challenge to the status quo. It's a very stable, I've used that word I know a number of times, it's a very stable situation that what's going to be introduced by the Black Plague is not just instability, but an extreme instability. And so we're going to see that that becomes the motivator for the changes that happen as a result of the Black Death. And so even as we look at alternative timelines, thinking through what this backdrop means, for example, the situation with literacy, the situation with the feudal society, the situation with politics, the situation with religion is an important backdrop to understand, which is part of the reason for taking so much time to set that backdrop as we prepare to move into the discussion. So, for the balance of our episode today, what we are going to do is look at what actually did happen in the real timeline as a result of the Black Death. It's important to understand, again, the regular path of history before we look at what the alternative paths would have been look like. So, we've already said, and should obviously be apparent anytime, let's say up to 60% of the population is lost in a period of 15 to 20 years, that's going to have a tremendous impact upon a society. Now, remember, we have a situation, as we talked about with feudalism, where labor is what is given by the serfs, the vassals being the term for somebody who is loyal or has been given the right to possess land by a lord who owns the land. And the lord only owns the land at the permission of the king or the noble, so he's a part of nobility. So the vassal, or below him being the serf, the actual worker who would actually farm the land and do the work themselves, they're plentiful. There's a lot of need for the number of folks to do that in an agricultural society, and there's a large number of workers. And again, because of the lack of literacy and because there's the structure of the society that exists, there's no other real occupation other than potentially the clergy or the military, or moving off to some area where there might be more of a middle class, a merchant class, for example, more towards Italy being an example that's sort of an exception from the rest of Europe. There's really not much of disruption to the relationship between the labor that is needed and the amount of labor that's available. Labor is plentiful, and there's, as a result of labor being plentiful, the financial incentive, the financial benefits in that supply and demand relationship go to the one that's in this case requiring the labor, which is the Lord. There are plenty of folks, and if someone wants to be paid more, have a different relationship for participating in the feudal arrangement, the exchange of labor for services and for protection, then there are plenty of folks who can assume that role. It really is not a situation where if you're a vassal, it's really not a situation where if you're a serf, you can negotiate with your lord for better employment terms or for a better system. The system is what it is. You've been born into it. Your skills and your experience play to the fact that you've been born into it and supporting it, and there's really not much to come along barring war, or in the case of the Black Death, now something disruptive like plague that's going to change that. So when the Black Death comes, and in the space of about 20 years, anywhere from 30 to 60% of the population is wiped out, what is dramatically changed in a tremendous way is that relationship between labor and those who need the labor. Suddenly the situation is labor is not plentiful. The loss of life has resulted in a situation where there literally are not enough people to farm and maintain the land, to maintain the animals. There's stories throughout the time of the Black Death of cows and sheep and other domesticated animals essentially just running loose, horses as well, because there simply are not enough people who've remained alive to be able to tend them, and those that are alive are dealing with the devastation of having lost loved ones, are dealing with the devastation of what's ravaging through their communities, fear, the other things that are going on. And so when this disruption comes, one of the primary ways that the disruption changes society is by changing the numerical balance of society with respect to the different classes. Suddenly there's a loss of those that were in the position of being serfs and vassals in such a way that the economics are disruptive. And so really for the first time in a long time, there is pressure on, if you will, on wages. There's now a demand for labor, which used to be plentiful. And so now the lord's in a position where they either have to pay more or do things that are different in order to have the people come and work their land to make sure that they're able to provide and that crops are able to be grown and that sustenance can be maintained. And so the number one disruption from an economic standpoint, which leads to the other disruptions, tremendous loss of life, loss of labor, and a change in the relationship or the balance or the ratios, if you will, between the haves and the have-nots. And as a result of that, what actually is we see the first inklings and the start of an economy where workers are able to have a position of leverage back to demanding more pay, demanding more benefits, demanding more in exchange, and they have the option to go elsewhere because there's a need elsewhere. And because of the events of the plague, actually, one of the interesting things that has happened is there's a rise in the amount of religious pilgrimages that go on. And so, as a result of that, people are moving a little bit more from place to place and discovering that the impacts are widespread and that, if so to speak, the grass may be greener at the next estate just a few miles over, a walk away, and that Lord is more than willing to give more than your Lord is in exchange for labor now because the demand and supply relationship on that has changed. The other easy to see direct impact that comes from the change in the population and losing such a large percentage of the population in such a short period of time is that to the extent that there were positions that required skill or understanding inside of the feudal structure, for example, the blacksmith who would have taken care of the need of the horses to be shod and other needs to work metal there in the feudal estate, if you lose some of those that are sort of semi-skilled or somewhat skilled labor positions and you don't have a replacement for them, you suddenly have a situation where the economics are disrupted that way. So imagine just that simple scenario that I'm describing here, where a particular feudal lord had a blacksmith who was skilled at being able to shod the horses and do the other things that need to happen. Let's say you lose, as a result of the Black Death, that blacksmith and all of his family, all of those who know how to do those things well enough to be effective at doing so. You suddenly have a situation where now the need doesn't go away. You still need a blacksmith, but you don't have one there in your village or there on your estate. And so you may find yourself needing to travel to the nearby village, to the nearby estate, on a regular basis to get those services performed. And the realization may also exist that there are two blacksmiths at the village next door. And so one of them can go and take the place of the one that was lost at the village that lost its blacksmith. So again, you have, with the loss of population, the economic labor situation that changes the ability of workers to be able to negotiate and manipulate the unfortunate situation to their advantage to get better conditions and better pay. But you also have the situation where now there's a mobility that comes into play for certain types of skills that allow workers to need to move around and be able to sell those services to the highest bidder. Again, going back to my example of the two villages that are near each other, one of them has lost its blacksmith. You have one blacksmith to serve two villages. That either means that blacksmith makes a whole lot more or is able to charge more because of the scarcity of his skill for both villages, or he just obtains more income because of performing those services for a larger group of people, or he can choose to sell his services to the lord or to the village where it's going to be most profitable for him. So again, the loss of population in a big sense, general unskilled labor, changes the labor economic relationship, but it also has an impact when you start looking at semi-skilled or the types of things, types of labor that was somewhat specialized that could also be lost, and that also disrupted the economics of the situation, the economics of feudalism. In fact, in addition to killing 30 to 60% of the population of Europe, the other thing that you could reasonably argue and reasonably say is that the Black Death brought the ultimate death to feudalism as an economic slash political structure in Europe, because what was needed to sustain it and had existed before the Black Death no longer existed after the Black Death, and there is a requirement for the change. And again, it's important to emphasize that this all happens not over the course of several generations, over the course of a century. It wasn't a gradual change, it was an abrupt, disruptive change. And so it's not a situation where you can see the trend that's happening, and if you're a lord who controls an estate, and you can start to see that you're seeing a trend here in terms of the available labor resource and what you need to secure that labor resource, and you can start making gradual adjustments to how you do that. This happens suddenly. It happens sometimes very suddenly in a particular area where the arrival of the plague, the major impact from the plague, at least in that particular wave of the plague, could happen in a matter of days or a matter of weeks. And so you go from a situation of the stability that's been enjoyed for several centuries and the way that the economics and the way that society functions around that stability to literally in a matter of days, weeks, months at the most, a tremendous disruption that has totally changed the landscape in which you're functioning. And so, in addition to just the stress of the fact that there are people that are becoming sick, there's people that are scared, there's death, there's the need to dispose of bodies, there's the need to have an organized way of dealing with that from a society, political structure. All of that happens very subtly in terms of how it changes. And so the impact of the Black Death in the real time line is it shakes the economic and political foundations of Europe, and it shakes them hard and it shakes them quick, producing something that is sort of forming itself on the fly and evolving into what it's going to be, that is unstable and is insecure and is confusing. And you're dealing with a society that is responding obviously to a tremendous, the health crisis is one thing. There's the emotional impact of the Black Death is one thing, but that is made even more profoundly felt by what's going on with a sudden change in how society works. The other major disruption that we're going to cover today, sort of in this introductory episode to the multi-part discussion and review of an alternative to the Black Death, is going to focus on the institution of the church. As I mentioned earlier, the church is a single unified body, the Catholic Church, not just the big C as we think of that today, but the little c meaning universal. It was one church. And it is tightly woven with that feudal structure, with the political structure, and it is a very stable and has been a very stable organization for a long period of time with little or no challenge to its authority. It's comprised of centralized authority contained in the papacy, and it's the regional authorities, the local authorities, the bishops, the cardinals, the others who have authority throughout Europe and throughout Christendom, as it is, are there as a result of a system that has been in existence for centuries. It's been in existence for a very long period of time, a very stable system. It's very common for the younger sons or even the older sons of lower nobles to go into the clergy because they are able to go and obtain an education. And so there's this sort of self-fulfilling cyclical arrangement that occurs where the universities and the other institutions of learning are primarily, in fact almost exclusively, theological in their bend. And so you're someone who goes to university, so you study a general course of study, but primarily a theological course of study, which then makes you qualified to be in the clergy, which then, once you enter the clergy, you may, even if you continue in the educational side, you then become an instructor. And so the church and what we think of as being education are very closely tied together. As a result, if you were not from the noble class, it was a fairly rare event for you to move up into a position of authority within the clergy. Your alternative to that might be to enter the clergy in the form of one of the various monastic orders, which did accept those from all types of walks of life, but there you would have been committing to also a very structured, perhaps even more structured arrangement than you would have in terms of staying and providing your labor as a worker inside of the feudal system. You now would have entered into as a different type of laborer inside of the ecclesiastical system. And while it was or is possible that someone could rise up through the ranks of, say, the Franciscan friars to become a leader inside of a monastery, to become a leader inside of the order, and there is a path for advancement there up into what might be considered to be sort of the higher orders of the clergy. That was nowhere close to being the norm. And in fact, many of those orders were still directed by clergy members who had come from those that had more means or those that represented the nobility. And so even those who were not working as laborers in the feudal society for the agricultural benefits for the most part, were not participating in the military or as soldiers that entered the church, entered if they did not come through the path of education, they entered into just a different type of life of service in exchange for protection and in exchange for the basics of life. So, what happens when the Black Death occurs? It was not limited to those outside the clergy in terms of who it hit. In fact, the loss, the death percentages, the mortality percentages are equally as devastating inside of the church as they are outside the church. And in fact, in some cases, because of care, exposure, because of delivering last rites and the other activities that the clergy were engaged in some cases or in some communities, the percentage of those that were inside the church in positions of service or positions of authority actually suffered higher mortality rates than the population in general. Cast that in the backdrop of many people believing that the plague itself, the Black Death, was a sign of an apocalyptic end, that it was fulfilling Scripture, and that it was judgment from God, where it carried a religious overtone in addition to, in fact, even more so than a health overtone. It was thought as being something that was the result of punishment or consequence being meted out by God. There also came to be something of a backlash or just a lack of general faith in the church proper as an institution. They those who were suffering from the plague, who were just part of the regular citizenry, looked around and saw that there was no difference between them and those who wore the cloth. That the Black Death was no respecter of someone's ecclesiastical position or the fact that they were a member of the clergy. It worked the same, and so as a result, there was something of a loss of faith or belief in the church as being an institution that could be one that saved. Then also the problem then becomes there's still a need for those people that are in the position that have been lost, that have been in clergy positions that have died as a result of the Black Death. And so suddenly, just like there's a need for labor in the economic side, in the agricultural side, there's a need for labor in the forms of filling the position of priests and other positions of importance inside of the church. And so it's possible now for the first time for many folks who would not have been able to go down that path because they didn't have the educational background, they didn't have the hereditary background to be able to be brought into the church. Suddenly there's a need inside the church, and so there's an opening for those who would not have been accepted, would not have been even deemed qualified before to be priests, or suddenly now in a position where they can become priests, and as a result they can rise to other positions, up to being bishops, other positions of authority. They do this in a very, very short period of time. There's not time to train them up. There's not time to send them off to the formal education. So many of the folks that are now assuming the role of priest may have been illiterate. They may have been only partially versed in the types of things that were normally known because of the normal education for a priest. There was not the normal period of time of becoming a deacon for a number of years or a period of time and then transitioning into being a priest and then rising up through the ranks to bishop, to cardinal. All of that was sort of thrown aside as a result of a very short period of time and a very large number of deaths. And so not only could those enter the priesthood, for example, who wouldn't have had access to it before, but they entered with different qualifications, and they entered and moved up through the ranks. Again, also because of the continued persistence of the mortality and the rates of mortality that were going on, they moved up through the ranks more quickly. And so instead of the clergy now representing, for the most part, the most literate, the most skilled, the most educated, in terms of their qualifications, they now are much more a reflection of the society to which they were ministering, and that all happened in a very short period of time. Add to that it was one of the places where you could almost be sure that you were going to be able to eat, to be fed. There was still an amount of security that was associated with joining the church and becoming part of the clergy. It became even more attractive to those that were drawn in to the vacancies that were available and who were able to fill those vacancies now without having to go through the same requirements. So as a result, the church as an institution, it comes under scrutiny in terms of society looking at its inability to ward off the effects of the plague. And also the church changes as a result of its composition inside of those who are now coming into positions of authority inside of the church and their level of education. So what does happen over the succeeding century and the next century are the types of things that eventually lead to the challenging of church authority, it not all being centralized, with the same level of credence being given to it as existed before the Black Death. But also, you have those that have been brought in the clergy that have different modes of thought or haven't had the same training. It's often argued quite forcibly that Martin Luther, while that's still a century or more later, comes into being because he comes out of being a member of the priesthood, a member of the clergy that comes from the middle class in such a way that never would have existed before the Black Death. And so, in addition to the changes in the economics and the politics and the labor elements that we've talked about here, there's a tremendous amount of disruption that occurs in the church immediately as a result of the Black Death, and then as in the succeeding centuries as it grapples with the change in, if you will, church demographics, how the church is composed, who's inside the church, who's inside of leadership within the church, and the church now responding to the devastating event that was represented by the Black Plague, the changes that are going on in the economy and the changes that are going on in society. And so there's a major, quick, substantial disruption not only to politics and not only to economics, but also to religion. And so there are many that argue that one of the things that happens as a result of the Black Death is that many of the things that we think of as leading towards the Renaissance and leading towards the Reformation are the direct results of the change that occurred from the Black Death and the speed at which that change needed to occur. For example, there's a need for technology to evolve in terms of the agrarian society and just being able to provide sustenance, to grow crops, to have agriculture work correctly, because there is no longer that large pool of labor. And so it drives a number of changes in a very short period of time. Those changes and that disruption, the opening up to new ideas, the change in society structure, all the things that we've already talked about at length on this particular episode come into play in a very short period of time. And so the Black Death is a catalyst for change, and the change that's produced, again, as I mentioned earlier, very often is pointed back to as being very positive. Things like the Reformation, even the Counter-Reformation back to that. Things like the Renaissance, the arts, literature. For example, with the loss of a number of priests who were able to speak Latin, what ultimately happens there is that more religious services are conducted in native tongues. And so there's even a change in the form of worship and how that's carried out as a result of the change in education among the populace there. Printing comes along where things are being printed now in the common language. Literacy, which again had been very low before, some estimates are as low as 5% of the general population being literate. Suddenly now you have a situation where literacy booms over the next 100 to 150 years, and with that boom in literacy, the printing press, the other innovations that happen there as part of the Renaissance and the growth of technology, and all of the things that happen as we transition out of a medieval Middle Age world into what's starting to become a modern world, is that there's a tremendous change in society. In fact, modernism comes out of that idea of the Renaissance, and so you can argue that if it weren't for the Black Death, that probably would have eventually have come, but it would have been much, much, much more delayed in terms of the fact that it came. So the Black Death is a catalyst, as horrific and as tragic and as devastating as the actual event was. It becomes a major catalyst for changes that happen, that are started there, that happen over the next couple of hundred years and reverberate down to our time today. So this actually probably represents a good point to break with the end of our episode today, ahead of what will be at least one and probably two subsequent episodes. And that's as we begin to look at what the alternative timeline would have been. As we've already seen in setting the stage today in this episode, sort of very different in some ways than what has come to be A Fork in Time, and that it was primarily mostly about the actual course of history. As we begin to explore the alternatives, it's going to have been important that we set this stage, and we're going to look at the alternatives also in those same veins of what we've looked at in terms of the actual disruption of it. So in an alternative timeline, we will look at what the economic impact would have been, the political impact could have been. We will look at the impact on the church, and we'll see how those can all carry their way forward, not only through the decades and the centuries immediately after the 14th century, but also how that reverberates down to our time today. So we ask you to join us again next time on A Fork in Time as we pick up part two of our explanation of what would have happened if Europe had not suffered the ravages of the Black Death. As we begin, we'll pick up in that particular episode with the first of several different sort of alternative timelines that we can think through in terms of what the impact would have been and how profound that would have been. I think it's a true thing and a safe thing to say the Black Death, the real event, the real timeline was incredibly impactful. Without the Black Death, there would have also been tremendous impact because of what would have happened without, if you will, the pressure valve of society being somewhat relieved by the events of the Black Death. So we ask you to join us next time on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. One of the best ways that you can find out a little bit more about us and understand a little bit more about how to interact with the podcast is at our website. That's aforkintimepodcast.com. Remember, the A is important on the end. The podcast is important on the back end before the .com. There you'll find, obviously, links to episodes, how to program the various podcatcher feeds so you can get the podcast delivered directly to you through your podcatcher of choice. You'll also see an opportunity there to provide us feedback. Feedback is incredibly important to the podcast. We're still new. We're still finding our way in this exercise, this journey that we're taking together. So we look forward to your criticism, constructive, even if it's not constructive, if it's fair. We look forward to your feedback so that we can incorporate that feedback and better understand how we can make the podcast better and meet the needs of the listeners, the folks that have found us. And we certainly appreciate those who have found us and are joining us on the journey. It's fun for us to do here at A Fork in Time. We hope that you're enjoying and learning things on your side as well. Also at the website, you can see how to provide some other things there in terms of becoming a member, where you can actually then more easily be notified of updates when new episodes are available. Other things that are put on the news feed there for the podcast. Also, a link to our Patreon page can be found there. If you enjoy the podcast, there's ways that you can support the podcast by becoming a supporter or a patron. There are some special perks, special gifts for those who are able and who are willing to support the podcast financially. We're not in the podcast business to make money. If so, then we've chosen the wrong business. But there are costs associated in terms of producing the podcast and also in terms of hosting the podcast, making it available. If you would like to participate in an active way in the podcast by checking us out on our Patreon page and becoming a supporter or patron of the podcast, we would greatly appreciate that. And again, we have some perks there that are outlined on the page for those who choose to do so. Whether you do that or not, you can certainly support us by providing ratings and also reviews at the various podcatcher locations that allow those. iTunes, Apple Podcast. Getting used to calling it Apple Podcast. It's still iTunes, but it's now called Apple Podcast. Google Play, Stitcher. All of the various links to those particular podcatcher feeds can be found there on the website. And if they have the opportunity to provide a review or rating, we would certainly appreciate what you would do there. We know that those reviews and those ratings can help us be found and be noticed on those sites so that we can reach more listeners without needing to pay for the types of things that would promote the podcast. Another way you can promote the podcast is by checking us out on social media. We have our Facebook page and our Facebook group. You'll find the links to those. They are both in the show notes here for the podcast itself. You'll also find the links to those there on the website at aforkintimepodcast.com. You can also certainly promote us by just spreading the word, telling other people, actually talking to folks. It's not necessarily necessary to do a social media link. You could actually have a social interaction with a real live person. Tell them you found this podcast and that you enjoyed listening, and maybe invite them to join you for a listen, or certainly letting them know how to find us on the web and how to get them incorporated into, if they're already a podcast listener, if they're new to podcasting, you can be the one that introduced them to podcasting as a general topic. That's how I found my way into eventually becoming the host of this podcast. I was an avid listener for a number of years and decided I would ultimately take the leap and go out and start my own. And then also getting the word out just in general about our podcast specifically. One of the other things that we encourage there at the podcast website is the ability to suggest topics. We have obviously an entire history of mankind to choose from when it comes to topics, but we'd like to know which topics you might be most interested in. And for our supporters, particularly for our patrons via Patreon, there's the opportunity to join us as a guest host. And while this has been a solo exercise today, if you're a listener to the podcast, you know that we often have guests or my co-host, which is my daughter Alexis, on the podcast. And generally speaking, the podcast is better when it's an interactive experience among multiple people. And so you have the opportunity to be part of it that way as well. Whatever you choose to do, we want to say again, as we always should and always want to, thank you for giving us the gift of your time and your attention. We know there's a lot of things you could do, and you've chosen to give us the time and listen today, and we do appreciate that. And we look forward to hoping that you'll join us next time when we pick up with part 2 of The Black Death Avoided. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Join us next time.